I'm Justice Paul Anderson. I'm a Supreme Court Justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court. Been on the court since 1994. But the reason I'm dressed this way is today is one of many celebrations of the sesquicentennial for the Civil War. And I am dressed as Loren Collins, a former Supreme Court Justice who came to Minnesota in 1854, served as in the Army under Sibley in the Dakota War, and served in the Civil War, mainly in the West, on St. Louis, Nashville, Montgomery, Selma. So I'm looking like Justice Collins, and what has happened is that you have encountered me and asked me if I would share with you some memories of Senator Humphrey and what he meant to the state of Minnesota. I'm going to start with probably my earliest memory. I'm a farm kid. I grew up working on a farm, milking cows, and one of the ways we do is, it actually is one of the ways that my college education was supported, is in the fall we'd sell some corn. Well, one year we sold some corn, and one of the loads of the corn was a little more wet than it should have been. 5 loads of corn, 4 were perfectly fine, 1 was a little bit wet. So the person who was accepting it on behalf of the government, it was a government program, was going to dock my father for all 5 loads. And my father said, that's not fair. He said only 1 load was wet, that's the way we do it. And so he was at a meeting and they turned down his petition and request, and my father's very vivid memory is saying, well, then I'm going to want my corn back. And the chairman of the commission saying, well, he'll come for his check when he gets hungry. Well, my father wrote to Senator Humphrey's office and said that this was not fair. And very quickly, he also wrote to his congressman and the other senator, who I won't name at the time, but he didn't get a response from them. He got a response from Senator Humphrey's office. They said, we'll look into it. And shortly thereafter, my dad was invited back to that meeting, where he was told that, yes, we will pay you the full price for the 4 loads that were dry. And he was only docked 1 load. And then the chairman of the commission said, and the senator's office also tells us we should apologize to you for how we treated you. Well, the year after that, 1955, we took a trip to Washington, D.C. We stopped by the senator's office. He wasn't in. But I remember meeting his chief of staff. My father met his chief of staff, and he came on visit, and he said, oh yes, I remember you, Mr. Anderson. And he said, did they apologize to you? See, that is one of the things that really personifies Senator Humphrey in the state of Minnesota. He had great constituent service. He really cared about the people of the state, and he took care of them. And it carried forward. When I was in college and ever wanted some information on a particular topic, I would write to his office and they'd send information. My first personal encounter with him, as I remember, was in 1962. It was at then President Kennedy was here. And I went to a rally and saw the President and Senator Humphrey, and it was really quite the thing. And then he, shortly thereafter, came to McAllister College. It was as part of a campaign for the governors. So I got to shake his hand and meet him. I remember to my mind, he always was, a very big person, having a personality. I remember being struck he was just a little bit smaller than I thought, but I remember shaking his hand. And so then, I got to know his son Skip. And through that I learned a little fact, is that I actually attended grade school with Skip for part of a year. Is that in 1954, Senator Humphrey was back in the state of Minnesota, and he had growing family at that time. He needed a decent place to stay, and so there was a place called Franlow Farms. It was a showplace farm located out in Eden Prairie. And so is that the owner, who knew Humphrey, allowed him to live there while he was back in the state campaigning full-time for the Senate. And so while Skip was living there, he went to the Eden Prairie School, small school. And that 1954 election reminds me of what I think is one of the interesting stories about the senator. is that, you know, he beat Joe Ball for Senate in 1948, and Joe Ball was very much enthralled with Washington, D.C., and forgot to pay attention to the people of the state of Minnesota. And so this young, vigorous mayor from Minneapolis put together and unified the Democratic Party. One of the ways he did it was to remove what was either the real or perceived communist element in the party. There was very much perception that the Democratic Party had a communist, sympathetic, Soviet communist leaning influence. And Humphrey knew that to really build a good power base, the left of center power base in the state of Minnesota, you had to combine the more liberal socialist leading Farmer Labor Party and the Democrats. But the only way that would happen is to remove the communist perceived or real element. And so there's some still real bitter memories about that effort where he transformed the party and was able to unify it. So you had a unified party, the DFL, going into the 48 election, and of course Truman won. But now Humphrey was worried about, you know, who would be his opponent 6 years hence. And there's probably only one person in the state of Minnesota, a very popular, good person, Luther Youngdahl, former justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court, ran for governor in 1946, although he is viewed as the Sunday school governor, the Christian governor. He had a very strong humanity agenda, equality. He was very progressive in advancing the state, very popular. So Humphrey saw that he would maybe have a real tough base and that Luther Youngdahl could defeat him. He also knew that President Truman said that Truman would do him a favor if he ever needed it. So in 1951, a district court judge on the federal district court in the District of Columbia died. Humphrey knew that Youngdahl had been a judge and liked being a judge. And so Humphrey talked to President Truman and said, would you be willing to appoint Governor Youngdahl to a federal judgeship? And Truman, who knew Youngdahl from meetings with governors, said yes. And I'm going to read to you a contemporary description of the event when at the White House, Humphrey and Truman and Youngdahl were there to announce the appointment. This is from Time magazine. Last week, Republican Youngdahl, fair dealer Humphrey, smiling side by side, stepped out of President Truman's office and made an announcement that shook their state from border to border. The president had appointed Youngdahl a federal judge in the District of Columbia. With one round of his gun, Harry Truman had just blown the head off the Minnesota Republican Party. Slick Senator Humphrey, who had laid the gun on the target, could chuckle. And so, of course, then is that I think that Humphrey went on to run against Val Bjornson, who could not provide nearly as much competition as Youngdahl, and of course won, and the rest is history. Of course, there's an interesting part of that history is Youngdahl became one of our most distinguished federal district court judges, and one of the first to take on Senator Joe McCarthy and his witch hunt. And in particular, as Youngdahl had the Owen Latimer case. Owen Latimer was a professor at Johns Hopkins who was pursued and persecuted by McCarthy. And so that story has a very nice end in that Luther Youngdahl went on to become a very distinguished federal judge. And of course, Senator Humphrey went on to his distinguished career, ultimately winding up in being the vice president and nearly president. He got the key question, the key premise that anybody in public service needs to answer. And I call it the legacy question. What is your legacy? If the people give you the privilege of being in public service, what are you going to do to make things better? What will your legacy be? He understood that. He understood that what a privilege it was to serve in public office, but the obligation that went with that. And he answers, to my mind, the legacy question very well. He made things better for the state of Minnesota and for the country.